The blizzard howled over the trenches, tearing through the night with an icy fury that felt sharp enough to crack bone. The air was thick with the stench of gunpowder and scorched metal. The darkness was absolute, like ink spilled across the world, broken only by the sudden fleeting flashes of artillery bursts, painting the frozen landscape in harsh shades of orange. Corporal Levent Kara lowered the heavy field radio from his shoulder, trying to steady his breath. He was deep inside enemy lines, where a single wrong move could mean death. Inside his pack was something far more valuable than his own life, a set of coordinates that could alter the course of the war. But his radio was dead. Snow had gathered on the antenna, and a layer of ice clung stubbornly to its buttons. Just hours earlier, his unit had been forced to retreat. He had been ordered to stay behind. The last words from his commanding officer still echoed in his mind. No matter what it takes, deliver that message. Now, alone in the darkness, Levent faced two choices: hide and wait for capture, or attempt the impossible and push forward. A faint crunch in the snow made his body tense instantly. He froze, breath locked in his chest. Two shadowy figures were moving slowly down the slope ahead, white camouflage draped over their shoulders, rifles slung at their sides. Enemy patrol. Levent lowered himself into the snowbank, becoming part of the landscape. His fingers, numbed by the cold, rested on the trigger. The patrol passed within meters of him, their voices muffled in a foreign tongue, carried away by the wind into an unintelligible hum. He knew that silence was his only ally here. One stray sound, one careless movement, and the mission would be over before it began. Time stretched painfully. When the patrol finally moved on, Levent reached into his pocket and pulled out a small compass. The sky above was sealed in clouds, no stars to guide him, but the needle pointed west. Out there, half a day's march, was an abandoned village. If he could reach it, maybe, just maybe, he could get the radio working again. He rose to his feet, the storm cutting into his face like shards of glass. Each step sank deep into the snow with a muted crunch. In enemy territory, it felt like walking a tightrope strung over an abyss. He didn't know it yet, but the patrol that had passed him moments ago had spotted the faint imprint of his tracks in the snow. And now, the deadly stillness was over. The hunt had begun. Lieutenant Sorel Tavolvanas adjusted the worn leather strap of her binoculars, the edges stiff from years of frost and use. The wind clawed at her cheeks, but her eyes stayed locked on the distant bridge that arched across the frozen valley. The enemy convoy was still hours away, yet every minute mattered. The mountain air wasn't static. It shifted, curled, and whispered through the ridges in ways computers could never fully predict. She opened her weathered field journal, the one with a deep crease running down its spine from years in her pack. On the inside cover, faint pencil marks formed equations only she understood, calculations taught by her father when she was barely old enough to hold a slide rule. Artillery isn't math, he had told her. It's reading the Earth's breath. She jotted down new wind speeds, her handwriting quick but precise. The barometric pressure had dropped again. Snow clouds were gathering faster than forecasted. The official team, the real team, positioned miles away, wouldn't even know until it was too late. And when their calculations failed, the mission would fail. Her earpiece buzzed. "Tavolvanas, status?" The voice of Colonel Harrow cut through the static. "Observer in position. Wind speeds variable. Recalculating for possible cross-drift," she replied, keeping her tone steady. "Noted," he said curtly. "You're there to observe. Do not engage." She closed her eyes for half a second, exhaling frost into the freezing air. Orders were one thing. Survival, hers and the lives of thousands depending on that bridge coming down, was another. A sharp gust blew snow across her scope, and she adjusted the elevation dial by half a click. A small change, invisible to most, but enough to shift the outcome over 9 kilometers. She could feel it. This was her terrain, her language. She looked back at the bridge through her scope. The shadows stretched differently now, the steel beams glinting faintly as the sun broke through clouds. Every detail, every flicker of wind and light, was a variable she measured instinctively. No computer could tell you how the sun's heat on steel might bend a shot just enough to miss. But she could. Somewhere deep inside, she knew that when the moment came, orders or not, she would pull the trigger. The cold bit into Sorrel's fingers, even through the thick gloves. She shifted her stance behind the howitzer, every movement deliberate, every adjustment echoing in the frozen stillness of the ridge. The bridge below lay quiet and unguarded for now, a skeletal outline of steel and concrete suspended over the gorge. But she knew that by sundown it would be alive with enemy engines and armored steel. Through her high-powered scope, she scanned the structure in slow, deliberate sweeps. She studied every beam, every truss, every shadow. She wasn't just looking for weaknesses, she was memorizing the bridge's heartbeat. The wind patterns here didn't just change hour to hour. They shifted minute to minute, curling around the gorge in unpredictable spirals. The convoy's arrival time was still uncertain. Intelligence had narrowed it down to a 1-hour window, but Sorrel knew the difference between arriving 5 minutes early or late could mean the difference between success and catastrophe. She flipped open her journal again and began writing a new set of corrections. In the distance, clouds thickened. She could smell the snow before it fell, another gift from years of living in high-altitude terrain. Snow meant reduced visibility for the convoy, but it also meant changes in air density and drag on her shot. She would have to account for all of it. Her radio crackled again. "Lieutenant Tavelvanis, primary team is reporting stable conditions. No changes necessary." She didn't bother replying. Stable conditions? What a joke. The primary team was on the other side of the mountain, their readings practically useless for her position. That ignorance was going to cost lives if she didn't step in. She pulled the scope back slightly and traced the bridge's central supports with her finger. That was the target. Not the convoy, not the lead vehicle. The supports. Take them out, and the entire span would crumble into the gorge. The convoy would have nowhere to go. Sorrel leaned back from the scope, resting her gloved hands on the cold metal of the howitzer. The weapon was old, temperamental, and lacking the computerized targeting systems the newer artillery teams enjoyed. But she didn't need them. She had something better, a mind that could read the land and predict its behavior. She closed her eyes for a moment, picturing the trajectory in her mind. The arc, the drift, the final devastating impact. When she opened them, her gaze was steel. She wasn't here just to observe. She was here to change the course of the battle. The first sound was faint, just a distant vibration carried by the mountain air. Sorrel froze, head tilting slightly as she listened. It grew louder, the low growl of diesel engines echoing across the gorge. She checked her watch. They were early. Sliding back into position behind the scope, she scanned the winding road on the far side of the valley. A dark speck appeared between the snow-covered pines, then another, until a whole line of armored vehicles snaked its way toward the bridge. The enemy had decided to move under cloud cover, hoping to blend into the weather. Her heart rate slowed instead of quickening, combat focus taking over. She adjusted the howitzer's angle by fractions of a degree, making mental calculations to account for the earlier arrival. The air currents had shifted again, curling more sharply toward the gorge. She scribbled quick notes in her journal, crossing out her earlier trajectory and writing a new one. In her earpiece, the primary team's chatter filled the channel. Target convoy in sight. Stand by for engagement orders. Sorrel muted the feed. They weren't going to take the bridge. She could tell from their tone. They were going to target the lead vehicle. That would slow the convoy, yes, but it wouldn't stop them from crossing entirely. The codes they carried would still make it out. She had a different plan. Through the scope, she studied the convoy's formation. The lead vehicle, a heavy troop carrier, was halfway to the bridge. Behind it came 2 fuel trucks, perfect secondary targets if the bridge collapsed beneath them. The rest were escort vehicles, armored but vulnerable to the gorge's merciless drop. Her gloved hand rested on the howitzer's firing lanyard. Her orders were to observe. But orders didn't account for what she knew, the kind of battlefield intuition her father had drilled into her since childhood. She could almost hear his voice. The difference between winning and losing isn't bravery, Sorrel. It's timing. Snow began to fall, fine and soft at first, then thicker, swirling in the wind. Visibility would drop fast now. This was her moment. If she waited for the primary team's strike, the snow would make her shot impossible. She reached for her radio, hesitated, then set it back down. No time for permission. No time for politics. Her breath fogged the scope as she aligned her shot on the bridge's central support beam. Fingers tightened on the lanyard. Every muscle in her body went still. The world seemed to narrow down to a single point, the exact center of the bridge's steel support beam. Sorrel exhaled slowly, letting the cold mountain air leave her lungs in a steady stream. Her gloved fingers pulled the lanyard in one smooth motion. The howitzer roared, the sound tearing through the stillness like a thunderclap. The recoil shuddered through her bones, and a plume of smoke erupted from the barrel, instantly carried away by the biting wind. The shell disappeared into the distance, a dark speck cutting across the snowy sky. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. Then, impact. The explosion blossomed at the heart of the bridge in a burst of fire and twisted steel. The central beam shattered, sending tremors rippling through the structure. The lead troop carrier had just reached the midpoint when the support gave way. With a deafening groan, the entire span of the bridge sagged, then collapsed into the gorge. The convoy's formation disintegrated instantly. The first 3 vehicles plummeted into the churning river below, swallowed by white water and shattered ice. The rest of the column skidded to a halt, soldiers spilling from hatches, shouting orders over the chaos. From her position, Sorrel didn't flinch. She was already recalculating. The 2 fuel trucks, still on the near side of the collapse, were her next priority. If she could ignite them, the resulting fire would block any hope of repair or crossing. Her radio came alive with frantic voices. "Lieutenant Tavelvanis, what the hell was that?" Colonel Harrow's voice was a mixture of rage and disbelief. "Confirmed direct hit," she replied calmly, eyes still on the scope. "Bridge is down. Target integrity at 60%. "You were ordered to—" She cut him off. "Stand by for secondary strike." The second shell screamed through the air, this time arcing toward the lead fuel truck. It detonated on impact, engulfing the vehicle in a ball of fire. Flames licked upward, black smoke curling into the snowfall, turning the pristine white landscape into a battlefield painting of chaos and destruction. Through the drifting snow, Sorrel watched enemy troops scramble for cover, their carefully planned crossing reduced to an impassable inferno. Her earpiece fell silent for a long moment before a different voice crackled through, a tone she hadn't heard in years. "This is General Tavelvanis. Well done, Lieutenant." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked down at the photo in her journal, tracing her gloved finger over her father's face before returning to the scope. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time, she knew she had changed its course. The valley lay in an eerie stillness, broken only by the distant hum of diesel engines. Lieutenant Elena Vasquez adjusted her position in the shallow ridge, her gloved hands moving with the precision of someone who had been in too many life-or-death situations to waste a single second. Through the narrow view of her binoculars, the enemy convoy was no longer just a shadow on the horizon. It was a formation of armored vehicles, troop carriers, and supply trucks rolling with absolute confidence toward the choke point. They had no idea they were walking into a steel-jawed trap. The American strike plan had been simple in theory, but impossibly delicate in execution. Allow the enemy to commit to the bridge crossing, then take out the structure mid-transit, leaving the rest of the convoy stranded and vulnerable to artillery fire from multiple angles. But there was a problem. Elena knew the primary artillery team, stationed miles away, was working off faulty wind data. She had tried to warn command earlier. They had ignored her. If the shot missed, the entire convoy would make it through. Her radio crackled to life. "Ghost Leader, confirm eyes on target." She pressed the transmit button. "Target in sight. Convoy entering kill zone in 3 minutes." A long pause. Then Colonel Morrison's voice returned, cold and clipped. "Stand by. This is not your shot to take." She clenched her jaw. That was exactly what they had said 3 months ago during the Mountain Pass operation. And 3 months ago, their hesitation had cost dozens of lives. Not again. Not today. Through her scope, Elena tracked the lead vehicle, a heavy armored personnel carrier with reinforced plating. Behind it, fuel trucks. Perfect. If the bridge went down with them on it, the resulting fireball would be enough to cripple the rest of the convoy. She could already picture the blast wave rolling through the gorge. Her left hand moved to the elevation wheel on her targeting scope. Her right hand adjusted for wind drift. Wind she could feel on her cheek. Wind no computer could accurately read in this jagged terrain. Numbers formed in her mind like a private language. Distance, drop, drift, speed. She didn't need the fancy targeting systems they'd denied her. Her father had drilled this into her, the art of making the impossible shot. 2 minutes to fire window, command said in her ear. She ignored it. Her focus tunneled to the sight picture, the exact beam of the bridge where steel met stone. A sudden movement caught her eye. 2 enemy scouts dismounted from a vehicle and began scanning the cliffs with binoculars. One of them stopped, lingering on her ridgeline. Elena froze. The wind shifted. Time slowed. She could see the man's mouth moving, calling out to the others. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might shake the rifle. There was no more waiting, no more asking permission. She exhaled, a slow, steady breath that carried the weight of every choice she'd made in uniform. Her finger tightened on the trigger. The howitzer thundered, the recoil slamming into her shoulder. For a fraction of a second, the shell was just a speck in the pale sky, arching in a perfect, impossible curve. Then, impact. The bridge erupted in a deafening explosion, concrete and steel twisting in a violent bloom of fire. The lead vehicle vanished in the blast, followed by the fuel trucks, which went up in a chain reaction of roaring flames. The shockwave tore through the gorge, rattling her teeth and sending a wave of heat up the ridge. The convoy was in chaos. Vehicles screeched to a halt, soldiers scrambling for cover, some firing blindly into the cliffs. Her radio erupted with overlapping voices, command shouting questions she didn't answer. She just watched as the fire spread, cutting off any hope of retreat for the enemy. For a moment, the only sound was the crackle of burning fuel. And in that silence, Elena knew 2 things with absolute certainty. The mission was saved, and her career was over. The echoes of the explosion still rolled through the valley when Elena eased back from her firing position. The acrid scent of burning diesel clung to the air, carried on gusts that tugged at her hood. Below, the once pristine steel bridge lay in twisted ruins, its skeletal remains jutting out from the gorge like the broken ribs of some fallen giant. Through her binoculars, she saw the enemy soldiers scrambling, some dragging the wounded, others retreating behind the cover of their stalled vehicles. None of them were advancing now. The fire had carved a line they couldn't cross. Her earpiece crackled again. "Lieutenant Vasquez, confirm. Did you fire?" She didn't answer. Not yet. Instead, she shifted to her secondary position, crawling low through the rocky outcrop. Every movement was deliberate. The enemy still didn't know her exact location, and she intended to keep it that way. A burst of machine gun fire erupted from the far side of the valley, stray tracers slicing the air above her ridge. They were panicking, firing blind into the cliffs. That was good. Panic made soldiers predictable. From her new vantage point, Elena could see the rest of the convoy halted in confusion. Radios waved frantically. Officers barked orders. She spotted an enemy commander stepping out from a covered vehicle, scanning the destruction with disbelief. Her finger itched to take the shot. One round, and their chain of command would collapse even further. But she forced herself to wait. Discipline was the difference between surviving the mission and becoming a casualty of it. In the distance, the faint hum of the American Black Hawk helicopters began to rise. The rapid response team was en route, drawn by the towering plume of smoke. In less than 10 minutes, the sky would be filled with the thump of rotor blades and the whistle of inbound missiles. Elena checked her watch. 10 minutes could be a lifetime out here. She pulled her father's worn field journal from her vest, flipping to the page where she had sketched the valley layout from memory. Her next move would be to guide the helicopters to safe approach vectors, avoiding the enemy's anti-air positions hidden in the hills. Command hadn't asked for her help yet. They wouldn't. But they'd need it. She keyed her mic. "Command, this is Ghost Eye. Marking enemy AA nests. Coordinates transmitting now." There was a pause. Then grudgingly, "Received. Stand by for confirmation." She smiled faintly. They could keep pretending they didn't trust her, as long as they followed her lead when it counted. The wind shifted again, carrying the deep boom of a secondary explosion from the bridge wreckage, likely one of the fuel trucks igniting. A black column of smoke coiled upward like a signal to the entire range. The trap had been sprung. She slung her rifle, keeping low as she moved to yet another position. The art of survival in hostile terrain wasn't just about hitting the target. It was about never letting the enemy hit back. As she climbed to a higher ledge, the battlefield unfolded beneath her like a living map. Flames danced on the shattered bridge. The enemy convoy was in total disarray, boxed in by the gorge and the wreckage. And beyond the horizon, the faint glint of helicopter rotors grew larger by the second. For a moment, she allowed herself to breathe. The mission wasn't over, but the hardest shot had been taken, and she had taken it. The roar of the approaching Black Hawks grew louder, their shadows flickering across the cliff face. Elena kept her eyes on the gorge below, where the enemy convoy lay stranded amid fire and smoke. Her next move would take her closer to the chaos, close enough to smell the burning rubber and hear the shouts of soldiers in panic. She slung her rifle across her back and began the steep descent down a narrow goat path cut into the cliffside. The rock shifted under her boots, sending pebbles rattling down toward the wreckage. Every step demanded precision. One slip here meant a 100-meter fall into jagged stone. Halfway down, she stopped, kneeling behind an outcrop to scan the battlefield again. The enemy had begun to regroup. She could see squads moving to establish defensive positions near the remnants of the bridge. A pair of anti-air emplacements on the far ridge pivoted toward the sound of the incoming helicopters. They were running out of time. Elena keyed her mic. Ghost Eye to command. Be advised. Enemy AA positions confirmed. Ridgeline, Grid 375, Mark 2-1-8. Recommend strike package before insertion. Copy. Ghost Eye. CAS en route. Hold position. Hold position. She almost laughed. There was no such thing in a situation like this. She pushed forward, the path narrowing until it was barely the width of her boots. Below her, the flames on the bridge flickered violently in the shifting wind, sending sheets of black smoke curling upward. The smell hit her like a wall. Diesel, burning flesh, scorched metal. It was the kind of smell that clung to your skin for days. At the gorge floor, she slipped into the cover of a boulder field. The sounds of battle were deafening now. Gunfire cracking from multiple directions, the low whoosh of incoming helicopter missiles. Overhead, the first Black Hawk swept in low, releasing a salvo that erupted on the far ridge in a bloom of fire and dust. The enemy anti-air nest vanished in the blast. Moving quickly, Elena closed the distance to the edge of the convoy. She crouched beside the smoldering wreck of a troop transport, scanning for any sign of movement. A voice shouted in a language she didn't recognize, followed by the metallic clatter of a rifle being loaded. She eased forward, peering around the side of the wreckage. A squad of enemy soldiers was clustered around a heavy machine gun emplacement aimed at the gorge entrance. They hadn't seen her yet. Her fingers brushed the butt of her sidearm, but she didn't draw. The mission wasn't about engaging every soldier. It was about controlling the battlefield. With quiet precision, she pulled a smoke grenade from her vest, yanked the pin, and rolled it across the ground toward their position. The thick gray cloud erupted instantly, swallowing the gun emplacement. Shouts turned to confusion. That was her window. Elena sprinted across the open ground, sliding into cover behind a low stone wall. From here, she had a direct line of sight to the bridge ruins and the path the helicopters would use to insert the rapid response team. She keyed her mic again. Landing zone clear. Marking with IR beacon now. She pulled a small device from her pouch, setting it atop the wall. The invisible light would guide the pilots straight to this location, ensuring they avoided the hidden mines the enemy had placed along the more obvious approach routes. Another explosion boomed across the gorge, shaking the ground under her knees. The second anti-air nest was gone. The sky now belonged to them. She allowed herself a brief glance upward. The Blackhawks were closing in fast, their rotors chopping the smoke into swirling patterns. Within minutes, the rapid response team would be on the ground, and the enemy's window to recover would slam shut. Elena took a deep breath, steadying herself. She was deep in their territory now, and extraction would be messy. But for the first time in the entire mission, she felt the balance tip in their favor. The gorge wasn't just a trap for the convoy anymore. It was a graveyard, and she had written its first chapter. The valley was no longer silent. What had been a tense, breathless stillness moments ago had erupted into chaos. Smoke plumes clawing at the sky, the sound of helicopters beating the air above, and the echo of explosions bouncing between the mountain walls. Lieutenant Sorrel Tavolvanis didn't slow down. She couldn't. Every muscle in her body screamed as she sprinted along the rocky ridge, the heat from the burning convoy licking at her side, even from dozens of meters away. Her tactical vest felt heavier with every step, the straps biting into her shoulders, the rhythmic clinking of spare magazines against her chest plate matching the pounding of her heart. Above, 2 Black Hawk helicopters moved in tight formation, their rotors chopping the air like relentless war drums. Through her earpiece came the clipped, urgent voice of Colonel Harrow. Tavolvanis, extraction window is closing. Enemy reinforcements inbound from the East Pass. She didn't bother to answer. Her breathing was too ragged, and every ounce of focus was locked on reaching the ridge's northern descent before the enemy sealed it off. The terrain here was treacherous, loose shale underfoot, jagged boulders waiting to twist an ankle or worse. Each misstep could mean a deadly fall into the smoking gorge below. Halfway across, a thunderous crack split the air. A section of the burning bridge gave way entirely, sending another military truck plummeting into the abyss. The explosion that followed shook the ridge beneath her boots, nearly knocking her off balance. She steadied herself with one hand against the rock wall, gritting her teeth, before pushing forward again. Her rifle was slung across her back, but her hand kept brushing the grip, a constant reminder that this run could end in a firefight at any second. And it nearly did. From the shadowed edge of the ridge ahead, 3 enemy soldiers emerged, weapons raised. Time slowed. Training took over. Sorrel dropped to one knee, unslung her rifle in a single motion, and squeezed the trigger twice. 2 targets went down instantly, the third stumbling back into cover. She didn't give him the chance to regroup. Another sharp burst from her weapon, and the last threat fell. No time to process, no time to breathe. She pressed on, weaving between boulders, every step calculated but desperate. Over her shoulder, the valley below was a hellscape of smoke, fire, and twisted metal. Somewhere in that chaos, the mission's objective, those seized nuclear codes, was reduced to nothing but ash. But that wasn't the victory the world would hear about. They'd hear about the impossible shot, the bridge collapse, the lone artillery officer who defied orders and changed the course of the operation. She finally spotted the narrow path down toward the extraction zone, a winding trail barely wide enough for one person at a time. From here, she could see the dust plumes of approaching enemy vehicles in the east. They were faster than she'd hoped. "Tavelvana's bird is on station." Harrow's voice came again, tighter now. 90 seconds or we leave without you." She didn't answer. Her legs were burning, lungs raw from the thin mountain air, but she pushed harder. The rotors of the Black Hawk grew louder until it was deafening, the aircraft hovering just beyond the ridge's drop-off. The final stretch was a near-vertical scramble. Her gloves scraped against the jagged rock, boots slipping once, twice, before she threw herself onto the landing zone. A crewman reached out, hauling her into the helicopter as the pilot immediately banked away from the ridge. Below, the first enemy truck screeched into view, too late. From the air, Sorrel could finally take in the full scope of what she'd done. The bridge gone, the convoy destroyed, the valley choked in black smoke. For the first time since the mission began, she allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile. Against every expectation, against every limitation placed upon her, she had won. But deep down, she knew this wasn't over. Operations like these had consequences, and the ripples from this one would be felt far beyond the Karakoram Ridge. The valley was silent for a heartbeat, too silent. Sorrel's eyes locked on the convoy as the lead vehicle reached the center of the bridge. Her breath slowed, her finger tightening on the trigger. Every calculation, every adjustment she had made through the day had brought her to this exact moment. The M777 roared, the recoil shuddering through her bones. The shell cut through the cold air, invisible yet inevitable, arcing high above the mountains, before plummeting toward the target. For a second, nothing happened. Then the world erupted. The bridge exploded in a bloom of fire and steel, the lead vehicles tumbling into the abyss. Secondary blasts tore through the convoy, scattering twisted metal like leaves in a storm. Her earpiece came alive with chaos, shouts, disbelief, orders shouted over the noise. "Who fired that shot?" Colonel Harrow's voice cut through the static, sharp with shock. "Lieutenant Tavelvana, sir," Sorrel replied, her tone calm, almost cold. There was silence on the line, the kind that only follows impossible feats. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the release of tension she'd carried for hours. She looked toward the plume of smoke rising from the valley and allowed herself a small, defiant smile. "This wasn't luck," she whispered to herself. "It's what I was born to do." Packing up her gear, she knew the higher-ups would have questions, maybe even reprimands. But none of that mattered. The mission was complete. Lives were saved. And somewhere deep down, she knew she had just taken the first step out of her father's shadow. As she shouldered her pack and began the long hike down from the ridge, the wind carried the faint scent of burning diesel. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the Karakoram range. Her job here was done, but the war was far from over.